let's cue the music and start that word.
All right, welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody here. Great to see Ben Yagoda, who's been a Twitter friend for years. And I said when a few minutes ago, I said it's great to meet you. You know, it's going to be great to talk to you. We've actually met. You did a keynote for ACES some years ago. I can't
In
remember.
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia was it? Okay. Yeah. So it's terrific to see you again, I should have said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Same.
Ben Yagoda, quick introduction, Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Delaware. He's published more than a dozen books, some on language, some biography, history. I want to ask him about this because I think he just does whatever he feels like. A lot of fun topics. His latest book is Gobsmacked, The British Invasion of American English. And this is an outgrowth of a blog that he's been doing a number of years, the NOOB blog, NOOB for NOOB, not One-Off Britishisms, which carries the subtitle British Words and Expressions That Have Got Popular in the US. So we'll ask him about that got there and a bunch of other things. He's had more than 3 million visits to the homepage, to the webpage. A lot of interest in that. He tells me that he's also starting a podcast, or has started, called The Lives They're Living, and we're going to ask him about that also. So welcome to the show. And you know, I don't know where to start. Start with the beginning, the origin story. What caused you to, before the book, start the blog and start keeping track of these crossovers?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And probably you and I are similar in that we tend to notice words and language. People who do what we do have that characteristic. And so, as you mentioned, I was a professor at the University of Delaware, and I taught journalism for the most part.
Mhm.
And back in the 90s, I started bringing study abroad groups over to London to study the British press, among other things. Once I had the pleasure of teaching a class on Dickens's London, including Dickens's journalism, which was great. But anyway, started reading a lot of, especially British newspapers, of which there are many from the tabloids on up to the August, and immediately started noticing that they said a lot of things and wrote a lot of things differently than we did. Of course, they would say different to what we did, because we say different from or different than, and they say different to. And that's just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of differences. And so this, growing in America, you see, Mary Poppins and the stage Britisher, and they say telly and lift and a few other things. But I didn't realize just how many differences there were. So that happened. But then the next thing was, over the next few years, and this would have been the late 90s, early 2000s, I started noticing these terms, or some of these terms, words and phrases, popping up in the US. And, it might have been confirmation bias that I was looking for them or I was attuned to them. But in any case, I just started noticing them to the point where, as you mentioned, in 2011, I said, I got to write about this. uh, and I started a blog, not One-Off Britishisms.
Mhm.
And I believe, well, not sure. Uh, one of the first, if not the first ones I did, was a phrase that when you tell young Americans that it wasn't always used in America, they look at me in disbelief or gobsmacked, and that's to go missing, meaning someone or something. We used to say disappeared or vanished,
Mhm.
but the British had said go missing, went missing, and Americans started to pick it up. And so that was one of the first, and then just more and more came. I'm still doing them 13 years later. I wrote the book. It's a trend that has not ended. I think the most recent one I did was a real new term, the verb pap, P-A-P. Now, are you familiar with that one, Mark?
PAP
I
verb.
was papped.
No, no.
Well, it means my photo was taken by the paparazzi
Oh,
or
okay.
the pap. So I was papped. And that
Excellent.
started off in the British tabloid press. And in recent few years, it's been picked up in the US as well. So, it shows no sign of abating.
Huh. So yeah, so paparazzi being not really an Italian word, but a character name in a movie, and then it came into British English, and then it came over to American English. I've not seen that, but I'll keep an eye out for it.
You probably will. That's interesting. I didn't know or had forgotten that it was a character name. What movie was that? Do
Oh,
you remember?
I don't know off the top of
Okay.
my head, but there was a Paparazzo was the character name, I believe
Interesting.
Paparazzo, and then it was added the plural to paparazzi as the
Right.
photographer. So it was an annoying photographer. I haven't seen the movie. Somebody will tell us in the chat um, what movie that was. But Gone Missing, I vaguely remember not seeing the term for the first time. I remember people talking about the term
Hmm.
as you say, as an observer of the language, people saying, what is this? Why do we suddenly start saying this? So it never struck me as odd when I first heard it. But it does have, I know, it has an interesting origin story. Um,
I see that the
the
movie
Dolce Vita.
Lynn Murphy,
Yeah,
the uh she's the OG, the original gangster of this field over in the University of Sussex, identifies the movie as La Dolce Vita, where the
right.
paparazzo appears. So thank you for that, Lynn.
Yeah. Well, I think we all have our assignment of what next movie to watch on Netflix. The Dolce Vita. I've never seen it, so it really should be on my list,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, it's not a Britishism, but that reminds me of the term graffiti, again, plural. And some people try to say a graffito for
Mm,
one instance of graffiti. That doesn't quite work, although that's probably the proper term for singular piece of graffiti is
right,
one graffito.
but what is a singular piece of graffiti?
Hmm.
Anyway, what if it's all
Hmm.
connected by one
One
line?
message, one
Yes.
message is a graffito. I don't know.
I do love going down rabbit holes, so
Right,
it's
right.
great.
Oh
That's
gosh.
but
Yeah, and in this day and age, with all the resources for language nerds like us, whether it's Google Books or Ngram Viewer or the English Corpora over in Utah or New York Times, Oxford English Dictionary, Green's Dictionary of Slang, there's no end of rabbit holes
right.
to go down.
Right. So I don't, if Heather's available, we talked earlier about, you mentioned Google Ngrams, and many of our viewers are probably familiar. Some may not be. If you're not, it's something that you will probably leave this chat and spend the next hour just playing with. But we have an example, I think, of Gone Missing. if we can get it on Google Ngrams. And I don't know how screen sharing works. Heather's sharing her screen, but I'm talking. Can we see?
Yeah.
Can we see
So,
her screen?
well, let's leave it on kerfuffle, Heather, if that's all right.
Oh, it's got
Okay.
Gobsmacked.
I see it's Gobs. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, Google Books Ngram Viewer, just to give a little bit of an explanation, and you can Google Ngram Viewer and get to this website. Um, what it is, Google Books has digitized more or less every book that's been published. Now you can't read all of them because many or most are under copyright and not viewable, but the data from them Google has and can share. So in this Ngram Viewer tool, um, you can look up any word or phrase up to a phrase of up to 5 words, and it'll show you in this graph uh, the relative frequency of use over time. And wait, there's more. For my purposes for this blog and book, it lets you compare the use in British books, that's the GB 2019, and American books, English US 2019. So this one shows that for the word gobsmacked, which is the title of my book, and it's a slang British term that means basically something so surprising that you smack your mouth, aka your gob, in surprise. And it shows that it popped up in Britain around 1980 and then sort of emerged a little bit in the US. That's the blue line in the 1990s, then shot up in the 2000s. So, for the words I covered in the blog and the book, this is a kind of typical example. It's relatively recent. It started out there and got picked up here not too long afterwards, and it's gotten much more popular, still not as popular in the US as in Britain.
Yeah. I'm a little surprised it took off so quickly, but and then it came so late to British English, but it's I guess a useful term. I mean, we have synonyms for gobsmacked, many of them, but it seems to be it has a nice sound to it, doesn't it?
It's colorful. Yeah, and so gobsmacked led to the adjective gobstopping, which I've written about. And someone just told me that they saw for the first time the adjective gobsmacking. So I'm going to be looking into that one in the next couple of weeks.
But wasn't there the candy
Yeah,
gobstoppers?
gobstopper. So
Yeah,
yes, and that became the in
yeah,
I think Willy Wonka, and that became the adjective gobstopping.
right. Okay. All right. So if we can call on Heather again to go back and apologize for, um, we're Heather's doing the screen share, so she's multitasking now. But let's do Gone Missing because this is one that
I would say to do maybe went missing as a more
oh, right,
common
you mentioned.
version of that.
Hmm. And this is, as Ben said, you Google Ngram Viewer, which is how I get to it. It comes up right away. Hours of fun, and it's useful, I think, as not just for the comparison, of course, but just typing in any different words, like which word is more common. You can
Yeah.
type in multiple words and get a comparison. In American, you can select American English, British English, or English in general. Okay, so
And
here's
yeah,
the,
a similar kind of pattern. That little murmurs in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
mhm,
It was used, but rather infrequently in Britain. And again, Britain is the red line. Started to take off in the 60s, uh, emerged in the US in the 80s and 90s, but really didn't come to the fore in the US till the 2000s. And again, as with Gobsmacked, uh, not as popular in the US, but still quite popular. now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so, as I said, when I first heard it, it's funny to think that this had been a term that I probably had never heard and then started hearing and thought nothing of it until others started talking about it. And I think that maybe those increases in both those lines and the frequency in U.S. English kind of shows how useful it just makes sense.
Yeah.
There aren't that many good synonyms for,
Right. Before Americans would say vanished or disappeared, which sounds like a magician, doing doing their act. Yeah, and as you mentioned, a lot of these terms are popular. It's kind of a Darwinian evolutionary deal that if they're useful and serve a purpose, they'll become popular. If not, they'll fall by the wayside. There's also a bit of a voguishness to some of these words. A word that I read about that a lot of people don't like because they're sick of it, because it's become a cliche, is bespoke,
oh yeah,
which, traditionally in Britain in the 1800s and 1900s was strictly used about clothing and shoes. A made to order overcoat or shoe was a bespoke. It got taken up by advertising and commerce and marketing. So you can have a, bespoke stereo system or bespoke marketing plan. And I hope it's reached or nearing the end of its run, because it is a little bit annoying.
yeah, it is, especially when it becomes used for everything. I've seen it at restaurants,
Oh, there was
bespoke.
bespoke menu or a bespoke
Yeah,
charcuterie or
yeah,
something like
which
that.
which
Yeah.
really suggests that they'll make it to order, I would think, but
Yeah.
no, not really.
No. Okay.
So, um, so, uh, so went missing. As I understand, there's an interesting origin that the first time it appeared, maybe one of the first times it appeared was in an American publication, but turns out the writer was British.
Right. My sort of hypothesis was that, and I think I first started noticing it in one particular news story, which was in 2001, and it was the disappearance of the congressional intern Chandra Levy. And that story is often cited as kind of a pre 9/11 story that got taken off the front pages by 9/11. So it was earlier in 2001. Um, and it had a very sad ending that she was found killed. Um, and it wasn't, looking in the rabbit holes, it wasn't the first time it was used, but there was one particular article where it was really prominent that I wrote about in my blog I believe it was the New York Daily News. And then it's great that you can get an email from the person who wrote the article, whose name, as I recall, was Helen Kennedy. And she said, essentially, I was gobsmacked to find out that wasn't a term in America. I grew up part of my childhood in Britain. And so I came by honestly. And, getting things like that is really fun. And also, in the blog, the comments, the catchword is don't read the comments. But in my case, the comments are, to use a Britishism, brilliant. They are funny, and most of them are from British people who are amused that this is a phenomenon, because they've been hearing all their lives kind of the opposite, that Americanisms are ruining or polluting
Right.
British English, like, awesome guys is, can I get a burger, and things like that. And to hear that it's going the other way, they find kind of surprising and amusing.
Yeah. Can we definitively say it's going the other way? You mentioned the recency illusion starting out. Is it just because we start looking at it that we see it
Yeah,
more?
it's a good question. And I feel confident that just because of all these examples, with those graphs from n-gram viewers showing it happening. Um, it's not to say that I can necessarily prove there weren't ones 50, 60, 70 years ago, or I know there were some, but as many, I don't feel there are. But I do cite in the book a linguist whose name escapes me, who did a sort of major number crunching uh, operation, and yes, confirmed that it's sped up, which makes sense because the last 30 years has been globalization of information, and I can sit down and read The Guardian, and someone in Manchester can read the New York Times, and we have BritBox, and then Friends and Seinfeld go over there. Journalists like Tina Brown and Andrew Sullivan have come over here. The Spice Girls, Harry Potter. I could go on and on. There have been more of these cross-cultural phenomena. So I do feel pretty confident that it is a trend um, in recent decades.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
I'll stand on that hill.
All right. All right. And somebody will do the full study, and some point we'll see. But yeah, no, I agree. And it could be that I have that because of the availability of British television, um, because of Harry Potter, of course, the books and the movies. I think you mentioned The Crown.
Yeah,
Those are all sort of such major influences. Downton Abbey, right? Major
right,
influences on
right.
American culture. And then you go back to the Beatles and the
Well, I
British
was just
culture.
thinking that the other day. The two words I associate with them didn't really catch on were gear and fab back in the Beatles days as the Liverpudlian. But there were others like calling women birds, and but those didn't really catch on so much in the US. They were kind of the colorful examples of the way they talked. But definitely they were a big cross-cultural phenomenon for sure.
Right. And many of the, and if you have a word you're curious about that has a that you've heard that's a Britishism, or you wonder if it is, just feel free to put in query in the chat, and you can ask Ben yourself about it in the room, because there are many examples in the book, and we won't get to all of them. So if there's one you want to talk about in particular, let's go for it. We can even maybe do an engram on it. And I, there. So okay. So my I said this before. My background is I have British parents, so I grew up
Right,
with
right.
terms that were, uh, I mean, some of the terms that have maybe entered the lexicon were things that I grew up with, and so I'm a terrible judge of,
Hmm.
when they came over. Some things I don't realize that because I use things occasionally and people give me a funny look. Not too often, but I'm curious. So doing the blog, doing the book, um, I going through the book, there are lots of words in here that I thought I did not know that was British in origin. Were there one or two in particular that struck you that you couldn't believe that they were not American words?
Yeah, I think a big source of slang was the British armed forces in World War One and World War Two, and there was I covered a lot of those in the book. Um, Things like posh and gadget, cushy, like a cushy job.
Oh,
S- uh, but I think the one that's the most surprising, it was RAF, Royal Air Force slang in World War II, was that something was a piece of cake, which a friend of mine was reading a book from the 60s, and came to a line where the author said, as the British would say, it was a piece of cake. And, you know, I thought that was purely American as could
yeah.
be. Um, And no, it was RAF slang, but it's so colorful and right and explains what it means that it totally caught on. And I think the various resources show me that it's more commonly used here now than in Britain. Um, Another one
Hmm.
that predates the wars is brunch. The portmanteau word combining breakfast and lunch. And it was sort of university slang in Oxford and Cambridge. They went in for slang a very big way. They probably still do. Started out around the turn of the century, maybe the 1890s, then caught on in the US in the 1920s and 30s. Uh, so that's a surprising one as well.
Yeah, yeah. Lynn Murphy just happened to mention brunch in the room.
Well,
Um,
I saw the comment.
you
I
did see
stole it
that.
from
Oh,
Lynn. Yeah,
you're
yeah.
working from. Oh, okay. Uh, yeah, so. Lynn is you called Lynn the original gangster of crossovers. Lynn's an American in at the University of Sussex in England, and she is sort of I think as a hobby as well as you did, sort of started checking these crossover words, charting these crossover words. Yeah, there's her book. I don't know if people see you or they see me. I should get my Lynn Murphy book.
Oh, okay. I'll talk so that
Yeah,
my
there you go.
Lynn Murphy book shows up there.
The Prodigal Tongue.
And she also has I think a Substack newsletter or a newsletter certainly, and a blog uh, separated by a common language. So
Mhm.
check out
Right,
Lynn for sure.
right. So we do have a question from the room. So
Not
go ahead.
Substack. Okay.
Not Substack. Okay. There's a MailChimp, Lynn. Well, you can see in the chat, Lynn's got a URL for her blog. Um, so Heather, I think we have a question or two.
We do. Our first one is Meryl. Meryl, we're
Oops, hi
ready
there.
for you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm in a dark room for some reason. Hi, Ben. Hi,
Hello
Mark.
there. Good to
Um,
see you.
so the piece of cake. I wonder what relationship, if any, it has with cakewalk, which it
Cake.
turns out has some racist connotations.
Yeah, I would say none. I mean, they both interestingly mean the same thing, but it was as I say, RAF pilots started saying it. Roald Dahl has a story called A Piece of Cake. Um, and they would not have been aware of cakewalk, which was an American thing. So I think it's just one of those coincidences. The other term that I associate with piece of cake is the opposite, which is to go pear-shaped, which means, something really goes wrong. And I've written about it and it's in the book. It's used a bit in America, but it has a little bit of a exotic sound, whereas piece of cake sounds purely American.
Hmm. Do you have the
Thank you. Speaking as
origin?
someone who is pear-shaped.
Do you have a,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you, Meryl. Do you have an origin for pear-shaped?
It was one of those slang terms that the fighter pilots came up with.
Hmm.
They were brilliant in coming up with these colorful expressions.
Huh. I'm just trying to figure out what was meant by that, but I
A
don't know.
similar one is, I think, was also military slang that's been picked up in America a bit, is lost the plot. So so and so was going great guns, but then they lost the plot. And yeah, that's another one of these ones that's very colorful and gets the idea across quite well.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we have another question.
We do from Patty. Miss Patty. You want to unmute and ask?
Does my microphone work?
It works
Yes.
great.
Oh, okay. I didn't think it would. Yeah, no,
We
I
can
was
see
just
you.
wondering about the spelling of gray,
Mm.
Grey, because all my American authors use it. And my clients want us to use the first listed Merriam-Webster, which is Gray. So are they being fancy? What do you think?
So you work with American authors who want to write Grey. Is that what?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I have a long entry on that, and I started noticing that a number. So as we mentioned, I was a professor for some years, and starting the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and that was one of the ones that my students used a lot, along with amongst, another
Mhm.
Britishism. They love amongst and gray. And I mean, were they being fancy or, I don't know, but it certainly is the case that the EY spelling is traditionally British, the AY is American, but the EY has made inroads in the US. Um, Maybe factors are the show Grey's Anatomy, which is EY. Grey Poupon Mustard is EY. Grey Goose Vodka is EY. And one of the fascinating things, one of these rabbit holes that Mark was talking about, over the years, there have been quite a few attempts by people to define the difference in color between GREY and GRAY. Some people say the EY is more silvery and the other is more green, and all of them contradict each other, but people seem to want to make the case that that they're different colors. But if I were you, I would stick with the AY and the similar one. And this is actually I have a category on faux Britishisms, where things that sound British but really aren't. And one example is the spelling of the word Divisive. Uh, George H.W. Bush and Barack Obama like to pronounce it divisive, which sounds British, but British people have never heard divisive. To them, it's divisive. The other example in spelling is advisor. American, all spelling, British, American, uh, up until like 30, 40, 50 years ago was Adviser. You're one who advises. You're an advisor. Americans started putting it as OR, and I think to sound fancier or more official or something like that. It's not a British thing. And I think probably we've led the way in Britain now. I think that's probably been picked up a little bit in Britain is the OR advisor, but the word is advisor ER.
Okay, I'm sorry, one more question. We don't want to run out of time. And
Yes, this one was posed by Aisha. If you want to unmute and ask.
Hello. I'm very excited for your book now. I'm thinking about the word pucker in particular, and I'm wondering what you learned about kind of Indian diaspora words that are really popular in England and Britain, and whether any of those are making it over here.
I have to say, I don't know much or anything about that word or that trend. I'm trying to think I think there might be one or two words I've covered over the years in the blog, but no more than that. And I can't tell you anything about it. Can you tell me about that word and what it means?
So pucker was made particularly popular, I think, by Jamie Oliver, who would talk about pucker food all the time.
Oh, right.
Really great food, like really delicious food. It's Pukka.
Okay.
And it's borrowed. And so it's one of those slang buzzwords. And I wondered, I mean, now there is a brand of tea available here called pucker tea. And so I just wondered if maybe it was starting to come in. I don't hear it in American conversation here. I'm in New York.
Yeah, no, I've not heard it here. Now when you say Jamie Oliver, I now can hear him say that. I mean, the word that is certainly not Indian, but sounds like that and is also food related that has come over here a bit is peckish, which is a useful word meaning, I guess, a little bit hungry. There's peckish, hungry, famished on that scale. And Monty Python used peckish quite memorably, and you see that in the U.S. A bit.
Yeah, that's one that I've always used, and that has gotten me funny looks when I've used it. But it's sort of known over here, but not used as much, or
Yeah, it's one of those words that I'm trying to avoid saying pretentious because I don't want to make value
I,
judgments unless I really.
I don't use it pretentiously. I
No,
just
not
think
you. You come by it
yeah, it's
rightly,
a
of
right.
course.
I grew
No,
up
no.
with it. Yeah,
But, if a New York Times food critic who
peckish.
doesn't have British parents says, well, if you're feeling a little peckish, it's colorful, and a lot of these terms are most widely used by journalists, and journalists like to write in a lively way that's not the same as everybody else, and it's fine. It is colorful. It gives flavor. Um, Sometimes it gets a bit much and becomes a bit of a vogue word or buzzword or cliche, like the bespoke situation. So in small doses, these words are great. They add to the language, like whether it's slang from hip hop or sports or whatever. It gives some flavor to the standard ways of saying things.
Right. So let me just shift gears a little bit, and there's so many other words I want to ask about, and we'll come back to this. But I speculated that you write about things that interest you. You've written a biography of Will Rogers. You've written kind of a biography of the New Yorker. Um, uh, when you catch an adjective, kill it. The parts of speech, for better and or worse, and the sound of the page, style and voice in writing. Trying to think, do I have another Yagoda on the shelf? Anyway, so am I correct in my speculation that this variety of stuff is you think of something, you say, I'm going to write about that. Oh, the B side, that's what I've got on my shelf. It's right behind you.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Yes, that's right. And every single one of those books that you mentioned was just that. It was something that I was interested in. I felt I would enjoy spending a couple of years researching and writing it, and I was able to, convince someone to publish it. And only one book that I've written um, has come from someone else's idea, and I'm not going to mention it, but the ones that are my own idea, I like best of all. Um, you know,
It does make
Not
us wonder
surprisingly.
now. What is this your least favorite of your books then?
Well, you might say that, but they're all good. They're all good.
Okay.
They've all
Okay.
been satisfying. Yeah.
All right. Good. And so you're retired now from teaching duties, and you mentioned the podcast. How did that come about? When did that? And actually, tell us about it because it's an interesting
Sure. Yeah.
approach.
Thank you. Well, it's called the Lives They're Living, and it sprang quite a few years ago. I had the idea, over probably a half dozen years ago, or maybe more. I'm an aficionado, not to say obsessed, with New York Times obituaries,
Hmm.
and not because I'm morbid, but because they tell the stories of very often interesting lives of people that I either hadn't heard about, like the guy who invented Pop Tarts, or the guy who was the first lead guitarist for, Procol Harum, or whatever. And just reading about their lives is something I find very interesting. So the thought occurred, wouldn't it be great to tell the stories of these people's lives um, before the obituary, while they were still around? And the idea started off to have it be a kind of produced NPR kind of show with music and interviews and archival tape and all that. And that never really got off the ground. Time passed, and then the bar to entry of making a decent sounding podcast with just a conversation back and forth, similar to what we're doing now, became possible. And I have a former student named Seth Goldstein who does podcasts and websites professionally. So he helped me out and got me going. And so the format of it now is that I bring on somebody who is an expert on one of these people. So I had one of the first ones was a very good writer named Michael Tisserand, who's written a lot about cartoons, and he talked about the great Jules Feiffer, and just had a great conversation about the great things Pfeiffer has done. I had on the film critic Glenn Kenny talking about Thelma Schoonmaker, who's edited every film that Martin Scorsese has made. And so I've done about 15 of those now, and I try to put out one every couple of weeks. And it's a labor of love. And it's fun to do something new. I imagine you found that when you started doing that word chats, it exercises different muscles, and it gets me out and about instead of sitting in my room staring at a computer screen and trying to come up with, the mot juste all day long. So that's the story of the podcast.
Right. I have to check when you mentioned Jules Feiffer, his name I haven't heard in a while. He's still alive though, 95 years old. So he's a Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist. This sounds like a really fascinating, fascinating series.
I had the sad event of one of my subjects did pass away after the interview, and that was my wife will get that doorbell, I hope. That was Chris Christopherson, the singer-songwriter, and had a really great conversation about him with Brian Fairbanks. In a few weeks after that, he passed away.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you've got the podcast, you're working on anything else right now, another book?
Yes, I have two books in various stages. Again, as I was saying, trying to do new things. I ended up writing a historical novel about someone who spent a good deal of time in Ohio, and that was the writer O. Henry. I wrote a novel about O. Henry's years in New York in the first decade of the 20th century, after he had served 3.5 years in the Ohio penitentiary for embezzlement. And that's going to be published next fall probably. And I'm kind of halfway through a book on a language writing related topic, and this is a general book about irony, which is a big topic, and it's been a fun challenge to try to get my hands around it, but that's what I'm working on right now.
That sounds really fascinating. I'd say editors know it's misunderstood, but it's also a little bit difficult to define what is irony.
Yes.
What constitutes irony. So, okay, we'll be looking forward to that one as well. So let's get back to the words. We have 13 more minutes, so if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. If there's a particular word that you're wondering about, its origins. I wanted to ask you about chat show, because we use it. Is that word chat? I don't know that I don't know if I think we started calling it chat show to be quirky, but it also seems a lot more friendly than talk show. But, and I don't know if we started using it before we had the name that word chat or after. Heather Saunders, our producer, came up with that word chat as as a name, and we said, okay, it's a chat show, I think. Is that something, I don't know that it is something that has made it across
Not
the
so much, no. And it's, as you say, it has a little bit different feel from talk show, but as I understand it, it's the same thing. What we call a talk show, they call a chat show. Um, and, another term from the world of broadcast is a presenter. We call it a host, they call it a presenter. That hasn't really made it over here as well. Um, but yeah, I like chat show. It sounds more friendly.
Yeah. One thing we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we had the World English's editor Danica Salazar for the Oxford English Dictionary, and we were talking about um, uh, Australian words
Hmm.
that have entered the OED, not necessarily that have made it into American English, but have entered the general English lexicon. And one thing that I found interesting was cheeky, which we mentioned, and that has a Aboriginal meaning that's sort of different,
Hmm.
and that is something that is maybe dangerous. So, like the example was a cheeky dog is something you want to avoid because it's not just sort of an uppity um, dog; it has a different meaning over
Right.
there. Yeah, and so
Cheeky's an interesting one. Mike Myers in his character Simon on Saturday Night Live, and I think also in the Austin Powers Spy Who Shagged Me used cheeky monkey a lot. Was
mhm.
one of the roots by which it came to American English. And then the other thing that people can Google, and this is a great rabbit hole, is the cheeky Nando's phenomenon. Cheeky and then Nando apostrophe S. And if we only have 11 minutes, that's not enough time to explain cheeky Nando's, but I would recommend they look into that. Um, the Australian thing is interesting. You mentioned I'm retired from teaching. I still take study abroad classes actually to Australia, usually every other year in January, which is their summer. And a couple of terms in the book originated in Australia, and one is no worries, no worries, which
Mhm.
is came to America first, was Australia, then to Britain, and then to America. And it's become one of those things that some people find annoying. It's known, no worries mate is known as the kind of Australian, national saying. And there's even a spoonerism, uh, no wuckin' furries, mate. And I'll let people figure out where that came from.
Yeah,
Um,
we
and
actually talked about that 2 weeks ago. That actually is
okay.
in the OED now.
Ah, and the other one is good on you, um,
Uh,
which is kind of similar to good for you, but it's the emphasis is different. Um, and one of my favorite little things, I think it's in the book, certainly in the blog, is a correction from the New York Times that something to the effect that it was a quote from an Australian swimmer, a female swimmer at the Olympics, and the correction said she was quoted as saying "good honor,"
hmm.
GOOD space HONOR. In fact, what she said was "good on you."
You mentioned I was curious about this. I don't know that this is in the book, but shagged,
Yeah.
which we had the movie The Spy Who Shagged Me, and we had this American coming up with all sorts of British terms. Oh, there's the engram.
Yeah. That's interesting. So back in the 1800s, it kind of went back and forth. I think that's got to have been a different meaning for shagged.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, baseball players, they
Oh.
shag flies. I think, the shag for making love is represented in that growth in the 70s and 80s in Britain, and then later on in the US, probably inspired by Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me. There's a quote I have from a British writer who's been kind of funny, and he was saying, I read this quote from a short story by Irwin Shaw talking about someone shagging flies, and that seemed like a physical impossibility to me. And of course, shagging flies is a baseball term that means catching fly balls in the outfield. Nothing to do with any anatomical procedure. So, yeah.
And I just noticed in the chat, Ben Zimmer shares that the OED's first citation for the sexual sense of shag is from Thomas Jefferson, no less. And,
Right. Yeah, and I always wondered about that. I mean, he was not many other people were using it that way back then, but he did use it. And further research on like what was going on with that quote is called for. But yes, Thomas Jefferson, Ben, another OG, Zimmer, formerly language columnist for the Wall Street Journal and Boston Globe, reminds me that Jefferson did in fact use it.
yeah, so and that's something that Lynn Murphy talks about a lot is some of these terms that seem very British actually had American origin. Have you
Well,
come across that in your?
well, one of those kind of a similar story is reckon. You know, I grew up thinking of Jed Clampett and the Beverly Hillbillies
Oh,
saying, "I
right.
reckon we'll be here," and yeah, it's an old-fashioned term and kind of had a staying power in the U.S., especially in the South um, and kind of backwoods contexts. Then, if I remember correctly, it kind of became a bit of a vogue among the chattering classes and journalists in Britain, saying what Americans would say, I guess, or I think that, I reckon that. And then in the Noobs, not One-Off Britishisms phenomenon, it has gotten picked up by American writers in the past 15, 20 years, in the New York Times saying, I reckon this will happen or so forth. John McWhorter, the language columnist, used it a couple of years ago. So that's an example of one of those old-fashioned British terms, had a staying power in America, popped up in Britain again, and then got picked up in the US.
Right, right. Things pop back and forth.
No.
I think we have at least one more question from the room.
We do. This one's Kate, if you want to unmute and ask.
Hi, Ben, would Shirley be on the thesaurus page for cheeky? And where did it come from?
I don't know. I recognize it, and I think that's right, but it has not, to my knowledge, come across to the US yet, so I haven't written about it. But yeah, it has that a meaning, I think, and still waiting to see it appear here. Uh, and there are a lot of great terms like chuffed. Chuffed meaning pleased or pleased as punch, happy is one that I keep waiting to show up in the U.S. And once or twice there are a few kind of outlier on the what I call on the radar uses, but I have not seen shirty yet. Shirty, I think, right?
I use
Yeah.
it all the time. I think it's hilarious.
Okay, I'm going to
Where do
start
you,
using it, and maybe you and I together
Yeah, we'll
can
get
get
on
it
the
going.
Instagram.
Okay.
where do you see it, Kate?
When I read, books that had been written in Britain, don't get
Oh,
shirty with me.
oh,
That type
okay. So
of thing.
you're not seeing it on the streets,
No, I'm reading it in the books, and I absolutely love it. I think it's hilarious.
right? Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have seen chuffed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's popping up here and there.
Coming up. Yeah, yeah. Good word. All right. Well, we have a few minutes to do a few more. Ginger is one. I think ginger is. I love ginger because it's sort of taken on. Well, I've heard it in my youth. Maybe I just
Hmm.
heard it because I was of my British background, but I hadn't heard it with sort of the negative connotation that it seems to in the UK almost always be a little bit insulting when it's used. but I suggested it, and I wasn't the only one, but I suggested it as one of Lynn Murphy's crossover words of the year, which you include in the back of your book. Some of these are words that have come from the UK to the US that Lynn Murphy does every year. And ginger was one that my kids started using because of the Harry Potter books.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So ginger, for those who aren't familiar with it, means what Americans traditionally would call a redhead or red-haired person, which doesn't really look that gingery to me, but in any case, it's used that way. You know, I think it got some prominence from the Spice Girls
Ginger
back
spice.
then, and Ginger Spice. And interestingly, I tried to do due diligence on this. Now, Ron Weasley in Harry Potter is a ginger, but I don't think that term is used about him in the books. I tried to look in both the American
Oh,
and British versions, and J.K. Rowling does not seem to use ginger, but it got associated with him in any case. And then the other famous, well, a couple of other famous gingers are Prince Harry and Ed Sheeran. So they're
hmm.
often referred to as gingers. And then South Park picked it up and had a couple of episodes, the animated series about gingers. And as you say, there's lamentably numerous instances of ginger bullying in the UK, which, I mean, bullying is never good, but because the color of your hair, that just doesn't seem right. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it does seem a particularly British thing. Yeah, the whole the ginger negativity.
Here in
Well,
Philadelphia, I'm now remembering we had a quarterback named, if I'm remembering, yeah, Carson Wentz, who was a ginger, and in the brief period when the fans liked him, they called him Ginger Jesus. Then they dropped
ginger
that pretty.
ginger Jesus, did you say?
Yes, they went a little bit overboard on their.
Sure.
Then they went the other way on Wentz.
So I wanted to ask you about the subtitle of your blog, British words and expressions that have got popular. I can't imagine. It surprises me that the British look at gotten as
Right.
a disgusting Americanism. Um,
They really do. I mean, I did an interview with a British radio presenter once, and I gave that as an example, and he just started bellowing at me, like, "Gotten, gotten, that's not a word." And he just kept repeating it over and over again, but it really seems to offend them. So yeah, they say, you know, we would say we've gotten close over the years, and they would say we've got close over the years. And gotten is actually an older one, and I think it's one of those examples of the traditional form that was maintained in the U.S. and got changed. It's useful because we say got for many other purposes, like got milk or I've got to go. And so for that, I think participle would be the term. Gotten seems to me very useful and not at all ugly, but they find it rather offensive.
yeah. All right. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. We've got out of time. We've gotten out of time. But
Gotta go.
we got to go. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you so much for this. It's been an enjoyable hour. We could do another hour on this. This is so much fun. Thanks also to quietly in the room in the chat, Ben Zimmer, who Ben is holds the record for most appearances on the show, and
Oh,
we're not gonna let him on camera because that would just like add to his numbers, and we'd have to get him special gifts. And Lynn Murphy, of course, who does the crossover list of British and American English words every year, and she's been on the show. You can find her on YouTube. You can find Ben on Ben Zimmer on YouTube, and soon you'll find Ben Yagoda on YouTube as well. We will be back. we're not sure the schedule yet, so we don't have an announcement yet, but watch your emails and the website, and we'll have another guest next month. And thank you very much, everybody.